Hello chums, and welcome to Tuning for Beginners, the series where I'll be covering every aspect of tuning and tweaking in Gran Turismo 7 to help those who are struggling. This series is aimed at road cars, since they are affected much more than race cars by changes to tuning. It's worth mentioning that my advice here will hopefully help you with consistency, but not necessarily with speed, so if you're chasing the last few tenths of a second at Sardinia to make grinding more efficient, I'm afraid this series probably won't help you. Now let's begin. So far, I've covered front-engine rear-wheel drives, front-engine front-wheel drives, and four-wheel drives. In this final video of the series, I'll cover how I go about setting up mid-engine cars, also known as MR, and rear-engine cars, or RR. While sports cars have their engines in the front, supercars have their engines behind the driver, tracing their roots back to cars like the Lamborghini Miura, arguably the world's first true supercar. Since then, we've been blessed with many interpretations on the formula, from sports cars such as the Toyota MR2 and Alfa Romeo 4C, to modern-day supercars such as the Corvette C8 and Maserati MC20, to the sorts of cars I had on my bedroom wall growing up, such as the Ferrari F40 and Jaguar XJ220. Meanwhile, Porsche seemingly exists in an alternate dimension, selling some very expensive cars with their engines in the wrong place. Jokes aside, the 911 is a car that's evolved in its own way to fill just about every sports car niche, and in Gran Turismo, a lot of what I do to set up mid-engine cars will apply to these rear-engined Widowmakers too. For my mid-engined example, I will be using the Chevrolet Corvette C8, not necessarily because I like driving it, but because I actually find it harder to drive than the majority of other mid-engine cars. As much as I'd rather be showing you a Jaguar XJ220, that car is far too nice to drive to begin with. As usual, I'll start with the car fully upgraded on racing soft tyres, and then I will detune it from there to give you examples of 700 and 600 performance point setups. Anyone who has driven the C8 on racing tyres will likely be aware of how twitchy and unstable the car can be, which makes it ideal for me to show you how to tame cars like this. One thing worth mentioning before we get started is the rear wing. Many people may choose to fit the Type B rear spoiler, which looks like the wing from the real-world Corvette C8R race car. However, this wing actually provides less rear downforce than the custom wing set, something you may also find on cars like the Audi R8 V10. In a car like this, it can massively compromise the high-speed stability, so I highly recommend fitting that custom wing set if you are using racing tyres for this car. So, with mid-engined cars potentially being more unruly, there's more personal preference that can factor into your choices when setting them up. As usual, I typically run the body height 10 to 20mm higher than the minimum to prevent wheel arch rubbing. Increasing the body height further will make the car slightly less agile, which can make it easier to drive. Too much and it will be prone to rollovers. Anti-roll bars typically work well on high settings, and setting it higher at the rear can prevent some of the lift-off oversteer these cars are generally prone to. Damping ratio doesn't make much difference. I typically set it somewhere in the middle, since low settings can make the car bouncier over curves. Natural frequency generally needs to be above 3.00 when using racing tyres, since it reduces body roll, which makes road cars much more controllable on these tyres. With camber, I usually set it to roughly 2 degrees. If you set it too low, the car will usually be slower. Too high, and your straight line traction and braking will suffer. Setting it lower at the front can decrease power oversteer, while setting it higher at the front can increase it, but it can also reduce braking oversteer, depends on your preference. For toe angle, a front toe out can help with lift-off oversteer and general stability, and rear toe in can reduce power oversteer. For the differential, I usually set initial torque to 10 to 15 on mid-engine cars, but this Corvette is particularly twitchy, so I've gone with 25. Lower settings can make the car more agile, higher settings can make it easier to drive. As for acceleration sensitivity, it works out much the same as with front-engine rear-wheel drive cars. For the majority, I set it somewhere between 15 and 20. I usually set braking sensitivity low since it makes the brakes feel sharper. Higher settings are supposed to reduce braking oversteer, however I've not found much difference in my testing. Rear downforce will usually need to be maxed no matter what the situation. In this car, front downforce is also maxed, but if you find the car is still twitchy at high speeds, reducing front downforce can help. Ballast is a matter of personal preference. There are a few select cars which are faster with some ballast weight over the front to make them more controllable, such as the engine-swapped 2002 Honda NSX or the De Tomaso Mangusta. If you find your mid-engined car is difficult to drive, adding ballast weight to the front can be used as a last resort, and it will massively improve the car's overall drivability. When setting up for a performance point limit, the same rules apply as with all of the other drivetrains. Apply the tyres you intend on using, max the rear downforce and minimise the front, add ballast to get close to a 50-50 weight distribution, and if your car is turbocharged from the factory, remove the anti-lag system, or in this case remove your turbo or supercharger if the car was naturally aspirated when new. Running your car naturally aspirated reduces torque and usually gives it a much more predictable power delivery. From there, reduce the power using the ECU and everything else can remain the same. When setting up for sports or comfort tyres instead of racing tyres, you can leave just about everything how it was. The only things that I recommend adjusting are the natural frequency and the body height. Reducing natural frequency and allowing more body roll will generally make a car feel like it has more grip when not using racing tyres, since a stiff riding car will feel like it's on ice when using less grippy tyres. Increasing body height will prevent wheel arch rubbing as a result of the softer springs. So, we've set up some MR or mid-engined rear-wheel drive cars. Do we need to do anything different to make an RR or rear-engined rear-wheel drive car controllable? Outside of the Porsche 911, there's not many rear-engined cars in Gran Turismo 7, other than the classic Fiat 500 and its Abarth sibling, the original Alpine A110, the Beetle, the DeLorean, and a few select others. There's also one or two mid-engined cars that behave more like rear-engine cars due to their extreme weight distribution. The De Tomaso Mangusta is a good example of this. I will use the 2016 Porsche 911 GT3 RS as my example for this video, since it's well known for being very difficult to drive when fully upgraded. It also has a very unique issue where the natural frequency is limited to 2.7 maximum at the front, which is a lot lower than I would typically recommend. This makes the car even more twitchy when turning into a corner. Due to the car's weight balance, it also suffers from fairly extreme lift-off oversteer and a very sharp turn-in, especially at high speeds, while it can also suffer from understeer when accelerating out of corners due to a lack of weight over the front end. While certain things can help with the lift-off oversteer, such as reducing the front downforce, adding more front toe out, or increasing initial torque, you'll still have the understeer when accelerating. While I've done all of these things, the car is still extremely twitchy, so my recommendation is to add a small amount of ballast weight to the front axle. Adding weight to the front will cancel out some of the lift-off oversteer, and it will push the front tyres into the ground, reducing the understeer when accelerating out of corners. Even as little as 40 kilograms of ballast will make a huge difference to the car's overall driving and manners, and the added confidence can almost definitely result in the car being faster overall, despite the performance point rating being lower. Once you start tuning these cars for a performance point limit, they become much easier, since you can use the low front downforce, high rear downforce trick, and more front ballast to your advantage, since both of them make the car much more stable, and they also decrease the performance point rating. Beyond that, most of what applies to mid-engine cars will also apply to rear-engine cars. So, I think I've covered most of what you need to set up your MR or RR cars. If there's any outliers you can think of where my recommended settings don't help, please let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to respond with a quick tune that should hopefully improve it. My next Tuning for Beginners video will be a supercut of every episode so far for a complete A to Z guide. Thank you very much for watching, and if this helps you, I'd be very grateful for your subscription. Take care and ta-ra.